nothing remotely similar has ever been experienced, people. Huge fires in the forests of the American West, again. And the growing infestation of these same forests by beetles that attack the trees weakened by drought. Diminished ice and snowpacks and melting patterns that deprive agriculture of the melt flow in the hot months of the summer when it's needed, but gives too much in early spring surges when it's not. 61% of the country in drought. The worst outbreak of West Nile virus ever recorded in the U.S. Lots of people died, and police departments in Texas put out public appeals for people to stop calling 911 when they had a mosquito bite. Now, there may be some humor in that, but think for a moment about the fear of a mother in the midst of such an outbreak whose child has just gotten some mosquito bites. These kinds of events were ones that Paul warned us about. In fact, he wrote the definitive story about the relationship between West Nile virus and the climate crisis. And the story is extremely clear. Also last year, half of the North Polar ice cap disappeared last summer, and the rest of it's on the way to being gone. And although the atmospheric scientists are really challenged by the complexity of the task, there's increasing evidence that the meanderings of the jet stream that comes across North America and then Eurasia are profoundly affected by the change in the heat absorption in that huge area of the Arctic ice cap that is now open ocean in summer. Crops experiencing heat stress along with the effects of the drought. Now, that's quite a year. And then, of course, Superstorm Sandy at the end of October. When the movie made from this book, An Inconvenient Truth, came out, maybe the single most commonly used criticism from opponents of doing anything about the climate crisis was that I exaggerated by showing ocean water going into the World Trade Center Memorial site. Haven't heard that lately. Governor Cuomo tells the poignant story of how he was there watching the water flood into the memorial site in the dark of that night. And then the subways, and you know all the rest, and New Jersey. And the Congress has now gotten to the point where the recovery is pretty expensive, and they just have fights and arguments about whether or not we can afford to help these people rebuild. And no doubt, we need changes such as encouraging people to move away from these vulnerable coastal areas and river deltas, and no question. But for all of the occasionally pious advice that we don't need to stop global warming, we just need to adapt to it, well, they have trouble even adapting to it. And the so-called sequester that's coming up in 3 weeks may affect the money that's been allocated to these people for recovery. What about in other countries? What about the 20 million people displaced from their homes in Pakistan, further destabilizing a nuclear-armed country? What about? There are so many examples. And as Jim Hansen and his two colleagues have also reported, the incidence of the extreme events that are so far removed statistically from the mean that they are called 3 orders of magnitude events are increasing 100-fold all over the world. Now, Paul would look at all this evidence, and again, as Eric said, he wondered why more wasn't being done. And before I end the description of 2012, I do just want to note in passing that it was also a presidential election year with Lord knows how many presidential debates. And with all of these disasters and catastrophes and warnings playing out on television every night like a nature hike through the book of Revelation, not one single journalist asked one single question to any of the candidates in any of the debates about the climate crisis. That is pathetic. So now we're told that the tar sands represent a promising new source of energy. And our country will face a question: do we want to improve the pipeline that will tap into these incredibly dirty fuels with much more carbon content at a time when we should be dialing back the global warming pollution that is threatening the future of human civilization? Do we want to dial it up and make it worse? It seems to me that's a kind of a simple question. I went up to Western Canada where that industry is located, and I was impolitic and undiplomatic, I'll say. They asked me what I felt about it, and I said, well, jokers find veins in their toes when the ones in their legs and arms give out. Intemperate, undiplomatic. True. Now, we face the question of whether or not existing coal power plants will be regulated. I said earlier, I'm so happy that the President is moving in that direction if I read the tea leaves tonight. Students here at Harvard have raised the question of divestment. And I cannot fail to address the issue, even at the risk of sounding impolite and undiplomatic. I served on the Harvard Board of Overseers. What many, well, no reason you would know that, but anybody who does doesn't necessarily know how that happened. Students who were fighting for divestment by Harvard of stocks implicated in the apartheid system in South Africa recruited me to be a part of their slate. And I said, well, who else have you got? And they said, Desmond Tutu, and I said, I'm in. And it was a really interesting experience. And as others had had in an earlier era, the experience that we had ultimately resulted in change. An earlier group had taken on the tobacco issue, and President Nathan Pusey's wife, I'm told, was, President Bach's wife, Cecil Bach, was the one who said, you've got to get rid of that. And Harvard did. And on the apartheid, Harvard did. Having served on the board during the time when But if I was a board member, I would do what I did when we took up the apartheid issue. This is an opportunity for learning and for the raising of awareness, for the discussion of sustainable capitalism, for a full-up exploration of what nonprofit institutions with large endowments owe the global commons and the ethics of the investment marketplace. I co-founded an investment firm after I left the White House involuntarily called Generation Investment Management, and my co-founder was a great guy named David Blood, and I really wanted to name the firm Blood and Gore. I thought it You may think less of me when I tell you that I really did. It would instantly be memorable. It felt like an old English marmalade company. But it was not to be. But we have focused on sustainable capitalism. And I've learned a lot. And to put this in context, before I conclude in just a few minutes here, I want to relate it back to the problems in our democracy and the conversation of democracy in which I believe the media is not playing a responsible role. When you look toward the human future, I think it's fair to say that we have two powerful tools with which to shape our future. One is democracy and the other is capitalism. Both of these systems have been proven, in my view, over time, to be by far the best way of organizing politics and economics respectively. Both systems, as we now understand them, were actually, surprisingly, born the same year, 1776, when Jefferson wrote the Declaration and when Adam Smith wrote The Wealth of Nations. And both systems are based on the same internal architecture or design. The belief that well-educated, well-informed, free people with access to robust information flows about political matters and markets could make decisions for themselves, and when the aggregate sum of all those decisions was collected, it would serve as a guide, and in the case of politics would be the wisdom of crowds, and in the case of markets would be the invisible hand. And it worked. And these two systems have been intertwined, spiraling upwards in the manner of a double helix, never touching, because if the money and the wealth and power from the economy is siphoned into the political system, then you got trouble. And that's what's happening today. Yep. Our democracy has been hacked. The operating system has been and turned to purposes very different from the ones our founders intended. When I first went to the Congress in 1976, I didn't have a Republican in the fall. Those were the good old days in Tennessee. And I started having town hall meetings. I can't even begin to tell you the thrill. I mean, a spiritual, emotional thrill in having the privilege of playing a role that our founders carved out for elected representatives, asking these farmers and shopkeepers and homemakers and others who came to sometimes churches, more often courtrooms, in every county, in every community. And they'd stand up sort of like that Norman Rockwell painting, man, standing up and saying his piece. I swear I could almost hear the battle hymn of the Republic being hummed in the background. What I'm trying to communicate go back and explain it. As Edmund Burke said, Representative owes his constituents more than simply voting what the arithmetical majority would say is the vote they want. But I felt that thrill. Now, here's what's going on. The principal factor that determines who is elected and re-elected today is who raises enough money to buy way more 30-second television commercials than anybody else in the race, to intimidate the primary opponents out of the race and to send the message, don't even think about it. And the sums have grown so rapidly that they now, this is not an exaggeration, the typical representative and senator now is required to spend 5 to 6 hours every single day begging rich people and special interests for money. And human nature being what it is, that has an effect on their thinking. And often, instead of keeping front of mind how to serve the public interest and how to do right by your constituents, they're naturally thinking, what impact is this going to be on telephone calls I'm going to make this afternoon? Because I know this one and this one and this one have a keen interest in this legislation. And their interest is going to either be served and result in a contribution or not be served, and then they'll give it to somebody else. This is what is happening. Our democracy is an impact. Now, again, I'm hopeful. Because the internet is inexorably replacing television. Not today, not tomorrow, not next week, but it's coming. And you see the young people making very skillful use of it. And you see individual bloggers having a profound debate on important, profound effect on important debates now. And it's growing in momentum and importance. And it can reestablish the public square within which democracy can work as it's intended. But capitalism also needs to be reformed. And I'm going to end with this thought. Capitalism is the best system for allocating resources, balancing supply and demand, is more conducive with higher levels of freedom, and it unlocks a higher fraction of the human potential with ubiquitous organic incentives that reward ingenuity and hard work and creativity. And so it's at the base of every successful economy in the world. But in spite of those awesome strengths, it is now increasingly associated with wild and more frequent disruptions in the global economy and nonsensical judgments about what's valuable and what's not. Take the subprime mortgage fiasco just as an example. That's what caused the credit crisis and led to the Great Recession and killed 10 million jobs. How'd that happen? Well, the first mortgage I made as a young man, I walked into Citizens Bank in Carthage, Tennessee, and sat across the desk from Walter Glenn Burton Jr. And he's still head of that bank, by the way, decades later. And he looked at me and asked me a long series of questions, the answers to which were designed to give him a clear understanding of whether or not I was going to be capable of making the monthly payments on that mortgage. And I eventually satisfied him, and then I made what was called, you may remember this, a down payment. Now, in the subprime mortgage fiasco, it was handled a little bit differently. 7.5 million mortgages in the United States alone were given to people who had no earthly ability to pay these mortgages back. And if any one of them had been required to sit across that desk from Walter Glenn Burton Jr., that would have been found out. And they couldn't make a down payment, and they weren't required to. So the idea was, okay, yeah, we see that risk, but let's lump lots of them together and securitize them with these fancy risk instruments and then sell them into the global marketplace. That way, the risk will magically disappear. Well, it was an interesting theory. It turned out to be stocks. And they were massively repriced in a short period of time, and there was, in essence, a global run on banks. And then credit seized up, and the Great Recession followed, and we are still trying to achieve escape velocity to get back to economic health. We now have $23 trillion of subprime carbon assets, whose value is artificially levitated by an assumption that is every bit as absurd as the assumption that people who can't pay mortgages back or even make monthly payments ought to be given a bunch of them. The assumption is that we can burn all this carbon in the ground. We cannot. We cannot. So we need to value what's important in an appropriate way. So in conclusion, I do believe that the dramatic changes in the way we communicate are now giving us a better opportunity to find out these needed reforms in capitalism and fix our democracy. I believe the work that Paul Epstein did has become central to communicating with mothers and fathers and families one of the principal values at stake in our decision to confront the global climate crisis. And I am cheered by the young people who are looking for ways to get involved. You know, when I was a young man, 13 years old, I remember when President Kennedy, I was at the JFK Library last night. I remember when he made that inspiring challenge to put a person on the moon and bring back safely in 10 years. And I remember how many people said, that's an unwise challenge to put out there because that's going to be expensive, probably can't be done. But 8 years and 2 months later, Neil Armstrong set foot on the moon. And the moment he did so, the systems engineers at Mission Control in Texas let out a fantastic cheer. And the average age of those systems engineers that day was 26. Which means their average age when they heard that challenge was 18. The students here at Harvard, who are seized of the moral imperative to grab hold of this climate crisis and find ways to raise awareness, inspire me. And the combination of your passion and the inspiring example of commitment to academic excellence and passionate advocacy that marked the life of Paul Epstein is what's going to save our future. Thank you all. You want to come up here and ask him here, Jim? Okay. Are you clear about that?
I'm looking at you from here. I like the eagle.
What people?
So, thank you for the address. It's a very good address. And